Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I have the pleasure of discussing with you an introduction to the spinal cord. That's right, the spinal cord really important and making up part of your central nervous system. And it's so important, and this particular video is going to be discussing fundamental anatomy of the spinal cord. So I hope you'll enjoy it and learn a few things. So, one of the first things that I want to say about the spinal cord is that it's about 18 inches long, or about 45 centimeters. It's about half a meter long, and of course, it's connected to the brain, and that makes up your central nervous system. And we're like, well, the brain. How does the spinal cord come out of the brain? Well, it leaves. This is sort of looking at a superior view, looking downward at the inside of the skull, and this big giant opening or foramen right here is the foramen magna, and that's the opening of which the spinal cord travels down. And its width, which I find kind of interesting, is rather narrow. If you haven't thought about that before, it's about a half inch or 14 millimeters wide, and it ends in a interesting as it travels down your vertebral column. It sort of ends in earnest at a particular point at the lumbar area, sort of between lumbar area, bone 1, L1, and L2. In this sort of root area that sort of reminded early anatomists of a horse's tail is named appropriately. It's the cauda equina, sort of translated into horse's tail, like equestrian or horse. Cauda equina. And so as you can see, it does extend all the way down into the pelvic region in the sacrum and even down, and it attaches into the coccyx bone, which I'll mention a little bit later. So getting into the spinal cord itself, let's take a look at a cross section of a cervical vertebrae, and this particular vertebrae. You can notice here's the spinous process right here. So this is posterior. And so if you look in this area right in here, you'll notice that there's two grooves that separate the spinal cord into two halves, and essentially, and it's pretty bisymmetrical. Okay, uh, bilateral. I meant to say bilateral on both sides. And what what you'll notice is that this groove right up here on the top is known as the posterior uh, median sulcus. Okay, median sulcus. And then down below here, a better view right over here, this is known as the anterior area right in here. Anterior or ventral median fissure. It's a deeper groove on the anterior side. And it's divided the spinal cord into two halves. As I mentioned before, it's bilateral. Again, here's another drawing of that. Number 9 here is the posterior median sulcus right here. And then as you notice here, here's the number 8 is the anterior median fissure. Okay. Now, if you look at the spinal cord, you may notice, in terms of gross anatomy, you'll notice that there's two areas where there's enlargements, where it's a little thicker. And so there's an area called the cervical enlargement, and an area a little bit lower or more inferior known as the lumbar enlargement. And those areas are a little bit thicker in terms of the fact that they have a little bit more gray matter. More to come about that. And basically, it's because of the fact that there's an increased neural input and output in those particular areas. What I mean by that is there's more nerve action controlling the upper limbs and lower limbs. And so there's a little bit of a thickness that occurs here. You could see it a little bit better in this picture. Here's what's known as the cervical enlargement right over here, which makes up the nerves of the shoulder and upper limbs, as I was saying before. And then down here, you can see this lumbar enlargement, which makes up the nerves of the pelvis and lower limbs right in here. Okay, a little bit more gross anatomy of the spinal cord. So this distal end or lower end right here, I was mentioning how what we're talking about is at the very bottom of the spinal cord, you get something known as the conus medullaris, conus medullaris. It's where the just below the lumbar enlargement. Matter of fact, the where it's sort of where it's a conical spinal cord gets a little bit thinner, right in this area, right in here, before it branches into the various roots of the cauda equina or cow cauda equina. And so this distal end is known to be particularly interesting. There's a particular segment right in here. If you'll notice, it's a thin fibrous tissue, the end of the conus medullaris. It's known as the phylum terminale right here, as you can see in green. It extends all the way down, and it anchors at the coccygeal ligament, and it anchors the spinal cord to the coccyx bone, which provides vertical stabilization of the spinal cord. We're going to see a little bit later in the video that there's ligaments that attach laterally that help the spinal cord stay in place. Okay, and here's another close-up of this sort of distal end of the spinal cord, or toward the bottom. As you can notice here, it sort of branches off. Really cool, I think, and really does look like a horse's tail right in here in the lower lumbar region. Okay. Now, when you look up closely like this, I was mentioning thicker gray matter. You'll notice here, if you took a cross-section of in the cervical spinal area, right in here, of the spinal cord, you'll notice that the gray matter is a little bit darker. Here it's shown in brown, but it's gray, and this is known as the white matter. Okay, and the gray matter is gray because the fact that it's densely populated by the soma, or cell bodies, of the neurons. And those cell bodies contain not only the nucleus, which stains a little darker and has a little darker, but there's a dense cluster of ribosomes in order to produce all the neurotransmitter. And so if you recall your neuron anatomy, you'll know that that particular area will stain a little bit darker. It's known as the nestle or Niesel bodies, right in that area, making up the gray, whereas the white is made up of axon, which are the long filaments of the neuron, which are often myelinated, giving a whiter appearance. Okay, so you have this butterfly-looking structure here, and then you'll notice how it thins a little bit towards in the thoracic region, right in here, or thoracic region. And then notice down here in the lumbar, there's also an enlargement due to an increased amount of gray matter, as you can see here. And then it gets more narrow as you move further down. Let's go take a little close up here. Now, just to point out these particular areas, I mentioned before this is the posterior median sulcus, and here's the anterior median fissure. This area in the center is known as the central canal. That'll come up a little bit later in the video, but basically I could mention it. It's sort of surrounded by gray matter, and it contains spinal fluid, cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. This area again is the white matter. This is the gray matter, and it sort of looks like butterflies and various horns, and I'll identify those a little bit later in the video. And as you move further down, you'll notice here there's going to be nerves that are entering into the spinal cord. So they're coming toward the spinal cord. And these happen to be sensory neurons. Like, for example, if you're feeling something, like, for example, touch. And this travels through a spinal nerve, and this is known as your afferent system of nervous system. In other words, heading toward the spinal cord, the central nervous system. This area right in here is the dorsal root ganglion. Now, the term ganglion means like an enlargement. As you can see, it's kind of bulgy, and that has to do with a dense cluster of soma, again, as I was referring to before. And these, if you recall your types of neurons, these are unipolar neurons, and so certain sensory neurons are traveling toward the spinal cord, and as you can see, it like a root entering here into the gray matter, and then exiting information in what is referred to as the ventral root, okay, which is also anterior. Ventral root are the motor neurons, which are then going to come together to form a spinal nerve, which is a mixture of both uh, somatic and motor, but it's also sensory and motor right in here, the spinal nerve. And you can see here, here's a thinning in the thoracic spine right in here, cross section of the spinal cord. And then as you get a little bit further down, you get the lumbar enlargement right in here. And again, this is a nice picture you could see here. Here's the conus medullaris, and as it goes down to the cauda equivoca, as it branches off down and below here, in your lumbar spines are branching laterally here to the side, spinal nerves. And then finally, it gets all the way down. And I was mentioning the phylum terminelli is attached down here in the coccygeal ligament, and that's how it attaches to the coccyx bone right in here. So providing stability for the spinal cord. So getting back into the into the roots, which are basically the nerves that are coming in and out of the spinal cord. You have these what are known as the dorsal root. As I was mentioning before, the dorsal root is posterior, and it's containing sensory neurons. And here you can see in the ventral root is more of the motor neurons. In other words, connecting connecting to muscle cells. Sorry, stumbling with that. And then, as you can see here, this enlargement right here is the dorsal root ganglion. And so that contains cell bodies of sensory neurons right in this particular area. Okay. Again, this is a nice model of, again, a whole cross-section of a cervical vertebrae. You can see the spinal cord. And again, you can see the dorsal root coming off right in here. Here's the dorsal root ganglion right here, which is ultimately going to connect into a spinal nerve. And the spinal nerve is conducting sensory information. It's being processed in the dorsal root ganglia, and then it travels over here through the gray matter, and then it exits over here through this ventral root right in here, and then this is a motor neurons, which are then going to connect together in what is known as a mixed nerve, as I mentioned before, coming off to the side here. Okay, and so the spinal nerves are coming off both sides, so laterally of the spinal cord, and again you have this dorsal or posterior, and then you have this anterior or ventral roots joining together to form a spinal nerve, which is over here. You can see here's the unipolar neuron, and of course there's many inside the dorsal root ganglia right there. Okay, and again, mixed nerves in the spinal nerve carries both the afferent sensory information in a unipolar neuron to the spinal cord, and then efferent motor neuron fibers are carrying nerve signals out of the spinal nerve, both on the left and right sides. Okay, this is more contextual. You could sort of see how the vertebrae, the bones, protect the spinal cord. In the obviously in the foramen, the spinal cord is housed. Here you could see the gray matter right up here, and this is a different orientation. So this is looking sort of at a posterior view. So here would be the dorsal root ganglia up in the front area. Okay, and again, those are the sensory neurons, and then the back over here is the ventral area, ventral root, which is carrying the motor neurons, and then they sort of come together or converge into what are known as the spinal nerves. Now, the spinal cord itself is protected and surrounded by three layers of tissues known as meninges, and these particular layers are important. And let me sort of discuss them just superficially, and then I'll get into a little bit more detail. So this outer layer, going from outer to in, the outer layer is known as the dura, which means like strong or durable, mater, which means mother. So dura mater, so tough mother right there, this outer tough material. And then just inside of that is the arachnoid mater. The arachnoid mater is a layer of tissue that sort of, I presume, reminded early anatomists under the microscope of spider webs. It's an arachnoid. And then pia mater is the innermost meninge, which is in direct contact with the spinal cord itself. Okay, those are the meninges. And I also wanted to point out the fact that the spinal cord is, I mentioned the foramen, but it's the vertebral foramen, of course. And then on the side, you'll notice these cervical vertebrae have these transverse foramen here, where vertebral arteries, and there's a nice shot here on both the right and left side, vertebral arteries travel down. You can see it here in this model, which are providing blood to the area. And here's where the spinal cord is sitting in the foramen right there. Okay, this is the spinous process, and then you sticking out this way. Now, if we look close up, back over here, we're going to look at this particular area right over here at the top of the spinal cord. You'll notice that the outer coating of bones, and there's no exception here in the vertebral bone, the outer coating of a bone is known as the periosteum. And the periosteum, as you could see, is going to be connected, sort of this gray area. It's going to be connected to this fatty material below, and these are blood vessels. And this fatty or adipose tissue below is what's known as the epidural space, right in here. So there's this epidural space that surrounds the spinal cord. And these three layers right here, this one, and this one, are the three levels of the meninges right in here. This is the dura mater and the arachnoid mater and the pia mater right in here, coming from outside in. Spinal meninges are specialized membranes that will isolate the spinal cord from its surroundings, and they're inside of the bone, and their functions include protecting. May have mentioned that before, protecting the spinal cord. They also carry a large amount of blood, and they're continuous with the cranial meninges. Now, this is not a video about the cranium or the brain, but the same meninges apply that surround the outside of the brain as well. And again, the three layers are here. You could look at the pia mater right in here, which is the innermost. Here's the arachnoid mater, and here is the dura mater right there. Okay, now those meninges are fairly famous because at times people will have infections of those meninges known as meningitis. Meningitis can be caused either by bacterial, which is more severe, and sometimes viral meningitis as well. And it can be fatal if not taken care of. Okay, and these are some bacteria that will cause meningitis or infections of the meninges. Okay, so let's look at a little bit more detail, if you don't mind, this outer layer right here, or tough mother, the outer layer of the spinal cord, and cranially, like again, back up into the brain, it fuses with the periosteum of the occipital bone. So it's where it's connected, and it's continuous with the cranial dura mater. So that's kind of cool. And then below, or caudal, towards the tail, it tapers to a dense cord of collagen fibers, and it joins with the filum terminale and the coccygeal ligament, as I was referring to earlier in the video. And then you have this arachnoid right in here, this arachnoid mater. It's the middle layer right in here, number 16, according to this diagram. And the middle meninge layer, or meningeal layer, is composed of, histologically speaking, simple squamous epithelial, and that covers the particular membrane. Okay, and it creates, if you could see here where this pointer is, it does create what's known as a subdural space between the arachnoid mater and the dura mater, which is actually not where it's pointing, but it's right in this area, right in here, is what I'm referring to as the subdural space. Okay, and in that space between the arachnoid mater and pia mater is contains a lot of protein filaments like collagen and elastin fibers, and it's filled with cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF, that sort of codes or covers the whole spinal cord. So this is a liquid that is found in the subarachnoid space. All right, and that cerebral spinal fluid carries dissolved gases, like for example oxygen and carbon dioxide and things like that, nutrients, in other words, various sugars, amino acids, and wastes of various kinds, like nitrogenous wastes. You might be familiar with the fact that a lumbar spinal tap, sometimes known as a lumbar puncture, draws CSF fluid from that particular area in order to analyze the composition of the spinal fluid when doing a diagnostic on a patient. So the pia mater, which is again the innermost or the closest meningeal layer to the spinal cord, it's also a mesh of collagen and elastic fibers, and it's bound to underlying neural tissue of the spinal cord. Now, coming back, if you will, coming back out to this epidural space, which is made up of this adipose tissue and blood vessels. I wanted to point out and talk a little bit about, a little tangent, but I think it's relevant in this discussion. I want to talk a little bit about an epidural. In other words, a procedure in which a physician or a nurse provides an anesthetic injection into this epidural space, sometimes just referred to as an epidural. Most famously, and there's a variety of reasons, but most famously to sort of numb the area in a female when she's giving birth, and so to relieve pain during delivery. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about an epidural. And so usually the patient is either sitting on the bed or lying down, and the physician or nurse will apply a Benadine solution to sort of sterilize the area in a field, and then local painkiller is added to the area so that a larger needle, known as a TUI needle, is not felt, and so the area is numbed right in here. And then this TUI needle, as I was mentioned before, is advanced into that inner space, into that epidural fatty area, usually a little bit lower in between the spinous processes of the L4 and L5. Now, really, it could be anywhere below L2. The reason is that it's a little bit safer down there because, again, the spinal cord is in less danger because of the cauda equina, and so the needle is a hollow epidermic needle. Let me come back here, and you'll notice it's slightly curved on the top, and so a catheter is inserted into this needle, into the patient. And it can be pushed all the way in, as you can see here. Once that the needle is put in, the catheter can be sort of pushed in, and then the needle is then removed, and the only thing remaining inside is the catheter. And again, for safety purposes, the epidural is usually inserted below the L4, L5 area at the end of the spinal cord, so there's less potential danger. Now, what's happening, if you remember, the TUI needle was slightly curved, and so that allows the catheter to sort of take an upward angle. And then really what happens is the nurse will add a little saline to the area, sort of widening up that particular space inside the epidural space, and then maybe a little bit of lidocaine. Then the physician or nurse will check to see if the patient is feeling okay, and then maybe a larger dose of anesthesia is added, known as a bolus, like around 10 milliliters or 10 cc's into the epidural space, to make sure that it's on the outside of the dura mater, it's important that the patient is able to move their feet. That's make sure that they're not tasting anything unusual in their mouth. And then once everything is secure, the patient then is able to control the amount of medication, which known as patient-controlled epidural um, um, during the procedure. And so, if during delivery the patient analgesia is able to tap on the button. Now, of course, you can't just overly control that, but you can add a little bit more if the pain is increasing. So it's pretty helpful during delivery. And so what that does, that analgesical medication is able to numb all of the body, not completely, but really deaden a lot of the pain in the lower extremities of the body, in the lower limbs, which is particularly important during child delivery. So getting back over here to this cross-section of the spinal cord, you'll notice here, again, just to get some orientation, let's come over here. You'll notice what I was just referring to is over here, this epidural space right in here. This is the adipose tissue. So this is where the catheter is being positioned, and medicine is being put in here. Now, I mentioned before, do you remember I said that the spinal cord needed to be held in place and stabilized, and there's ligaments both on the right and left side located here and here that stabilize the spinal cord. And then again, here is the subarachnoid space where the spinal CSF fluid is located right in here. And here is the three layers of meninges right in here. Meninges. Okay. Mentioned before, but here's the dorsal root ganglia right there, and the ventral root, which is a little thinner. Okay. And then here are the ligaments located over here. They're paired on both sides of the spinal cord, and they sort of extend from the innermost layer, as you can see here, the pia mater. They extend outward to stabilize side-to-side movement of the spinal cord, holding it in place. Now this is an awesome view right here. Check this out. Here's the ligaments right here, an actual picture of the ligaments holding the spinal cord in place. Here's an actual look at the pia mater right in here. And here you notice the white connective fibers, collagen, right in here. Here's the medium fissure right here of the spinal cord. And then the arachnoid is pulled back, and also the dura layer is pulled back so that you can actually see inside here. And these are blood vessels that are supplying the spinal cord. Pretty awesome view. And then you could see here are the spinal nerves, which are coming out laterally from the spinal cord. So let's get into a discussion. It's really relevant. I want to talk a little bit about the gray matter and white matter. And I know I mentioned this before, that the white matter is white because it contains myelinated, and the truth is some unmyelinated axons, but it gives a white appearance because of the lipids that are involved in myelinization. But I also want to talk a little bit about the gray matter, but let's talk about this white matter and gray matter. Okay, so the gray matter first. So the gray matter, as you can see here, which is actually colored in brown in this model, surrounds the central canal of the spinal cord, which is this little hole right there. And inside the gray matter contains the cell bodies and also the neuroglia cell nuclei as well. Okay, and so it's gray in color, and it has projections. It's sort of these little points that are coming out that again reminded early anatomists of horns, if you will. So these are known as, these projections, as you can see here, are known as gray horns. And so, of course, we will name them. And so we have the posterior gray horn. As you can see right here, this is the posterior side or dorsal side of the spinal cord. The posterior gray horn contains somatic and visceral sensory nuclei. Okay, and again, the nuclei are what's giving it the dark coloration. All right, and then we have anteriorly, which is down below right here, or ventral. The anterior gray horns contain somatic motor nuclei right in here. And eventually that's going to connect out over here in the ventral root, the motor neurons down below. And then we have to the side or lateral on both sides, we have the lateral gray horns. And they're in the thoracic and lumbar segments, and they contain visceral motor neuri, giving them a dark coloration. Again, you can see the white matter as well, right here. And then this is a cool shot. This is under the light microscope. So this is a cross section of the spinal cord under I would say about 400 magnification under the light microscope, and you'll notice this bridge right in here is literally called that, the gray commissure. In other words, bridge are axons that cross from one side to the other of the spinal cord, because the spinal cord is bilateral. Okay, and then again, you could take a look here. You could see that here's the posterior gray horn, and here's the anterior and the lateral gray horns right there. And then what's staining blue, interestingly enough, is the white matter. Okay, and again, mentioned this before, but I'll touch on it again, that the reason it's gray is that it contains the cell bodies of the neurons, and they form groups called nuclei, and they form in the posterior horn, dorsal. They're known as the sensory nuclei. The dorsal is posterior, and that connects to the peripheral receptors of the nervous system, which are receiving information, the afferent area. And then you have what's known as motor nuclei, and those are contained more in the anterior or ventral horns, and those connect to the peripheral effectors, which are getting something done, like for example a muscle. And those are where all the motor nuclei are contained, right in that particular area right in there. Okay, the anterior horns of the gray horns. So getting more detailed about that, it's pretty cool. You could take a look here. You're welcome to pause the video and take a closer look at this diagram, which is pretty intense right here. But you could see that, perhaps logically, you could see that these horns are even further specialized. Look at this. It's somatic and visceral area right here, and then somatic here. You can see here's the ventral root right over here, and here's the dorsal root connecting to the posterior and anterior horns right over here. And basically it determines what body part it's controlling. It's kind of interesting. We won't go too far with that, but it's kind of fascinating. So looking at the white matter, and again, kind of funny that the white matter, again, in the light microscope is blue in this picture, but you have what are referred to as posterior up here, posterior white columns, and then you have, and those are in between the posterior gray horns, and also on both sides of the posterior sulcus, right there. Now, the white matter, just to mention this again, is white because of the fact that it's the axons mostly that are comprising the white matter. And the reason that they're white is that they're covered with myelin, which is a lipid, which is the result of a neuroglia cell, which is known as an oligodendrocyte. And the neuroglia cell has oligodendrite, meaning a few dendrocyte, meaning little appendages that come off of them, which then wrap myelin around the axon of neurons, which creates this myelin sheath, which allows nerve impulses to travel more quickly when it's myelinated. And so it appears white. And so these anterior columns, if you will, are important. So this interior white column lies between the anterior gray, so as you can see here below, and then you have this area shown in green is known as the anterior white commissure, which is an area where the axons cross between one side of the spinal cord and the other. Okay, so the white matter. And so the lateral white matter, which is shown over here and over here on both sides of the spinal cord. So you have posterior white columns, you have lateral white columns, and you might have guessed it, interior white columns as well. And those are all about having tracts of axons that go in their bundles of axons, if you will, and they relay information in one particular direction. So when I say one particular direction, you have something known as ascending axons or ascending tracts, if you will, because it's like a box of straws, all these axons. Those are the ones that are carrying information in the spinal cord toward the brain. So ascending tracts, that kind of makes logical sense, right? And then descending tracts are carrying information or basically motor commands to the spinal cord or in a downward direction. Descending tracts and ascending tracts inside the white matter of the spinal cord. And again, you could see here, again, light microscope, the gray matter has this sort of a darker color and the white matter is a little bit lighter over here. And you can see this is emphasizing the horns of the gray matter, as you can see here. That's pretty cool. Okay, and then over here you can see there's a narrowing right over here, and then you can see this opening, which is known as the central canal. And again, I mentioned before that contains cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. And if you recall the fact there's a particular neuroglia cell called ependymal cell, and it produces that CSF liquid, and it also has cilia that help circulate it around. Okay, and the central canal is surrounded, as you can see back here, it's surrounded by gray matter. That's what I'm getting at here. But it contains sensory and motor nuclei, and the sensory nuclei are dorsal, the motor nuclei are ventricle. And I mentioned that before. And also the gray matter is surrounded by white matter, sort of as a summary of what we've been talking about. The white matter consists of lots of tracts, both going upward and downward, and they're axons mostly. They're organized in columns and they're bundles with specific functions. So I wanted to summarize and say, when one of the reasons why we would want to know about the spinal cord is because sometimes if there's a severe injury to the spinal cord, sadly, a person can become debilitated, and they may not be able to move their legs anymore. And it really is, since the spinal cord is so highly organized and the branches of the spinal nerves are so specific, it's possible to know if there's an actual break in the back. It's possible to predict the injuries, and sometimes they're local. Like, for example, a person may not feel their legs, but still will be able to feel their arms, etc. And so I wanted to finish this particular video with a little bit of a sad tone, but maybe a hopeful tone. I had the pleasure of meeting a really awesome person known as Kelly Brush, and just a quick background on her. It's a picture of myself and Kelly Brush here. She was a student at high school ski academy in Vermont known as the Green Mountain Valley School, an excellent ski academy, private school, and she attended the Middlebury College, and she was a ski racer, and she had a very unfortunate crash and slid into a chairlift pole and had a spinal cord injury, and she's no longer able to walk. But instead of being down about it, she turned it around into a major positive. She organized this Kelly Brush Foundation. You can see the website down below. And there's various fundraisers that are associated with this. The biggest one is the Kelly Brush Ride that starts at Middlebury College. And it's various lengths, but it could be 100 miles. And I participated in that. And it's a fundraiser in order to raise money so that ski resorts are able to provide netting and protection for future ski racers so that they don't have such unfortunate accidents. And it's also to provide assistive equipment for those who are injured so that they can still carry on their lives, both skiing and bike riding, etc. And so just wanted to point that out, that there's a seriousness to our understanding of the spinal cord. I appreciate your time and energy watching this video and trying to understand just the fundamentals of the spinal cord. But the truth is, if you really wanted to make a difference, you'll need to study it further, and you'll need to study it not just because of its interest, but because people are hurt and they need others in order to attend to that and make the world better. And so I hope this motivates you in your pursuit of a career in the health profession. And so appreciate your time, and thanks for watching. And I hope you enjoyed the video and learned a few things. Thanks for watching.